Hi, everybody. We're back. We're doing Kid Activists, and we are working on figuring out how to make the world a better place. This this is our last video. We'll be finished with this book, and the person we're going to talk about now is Malala Yousafzai, the girl who fought for education. 15-year-old Malala Yousafzai was on the school bus when a group of men boarded. "Who's Malala?" one of them said. No one spoke, but everyone looked at Malala. The man lifted a gun and shot her in the head. Malala's powerful voice had made her a target for those who wanted to silence her. But this horrific act of violence wasn't the end of Malala's story, and it wasn't the beginning either. Malala was born in Pakistan in 1997. Her family is Pashtun, a people of many tribes who live in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. When boys were born in their community, everyone celebrated. The birth of a daughter was usually a much less joyous occasion, but Malala's father was different from most Pashtun men. He asked his friends to throw sweets and coins into her cradle as they would for a boy, and he added her name to their family tree. Its branches stretched back 4 generations, but until then it had only shown the men in the family. Malala, her 2 younger brothers, and her parents lived in Mingora, the biggest town in Swat Valley. Malala's father was an English teacher. He started his own school where the teachers encouraged independent thinking. Even before I could talk, I would toddle into his classes, Malala later wrote. She would say, "I grew up in a school." Malala was proud to be Pashtun, but as she grew older, she noticed many things that seemed unfair for girls and women. When she pointed them out, her father told her that women had an even more difficult time in neighboring Afghanistan. A group called the Taliban had taken over the country. The Taliban was burning girls' schools and forcing women to cover their faces in public. They had even banned women from laughing. Malala shivered at the thought. The adults around Malala were constantly talking about politics, but Malala was more concerned about the poverty of children in her own neighborhood, kids who spent their days at the rubbish dump, sorting through garbage looking for things to sell. She thought every child should have a chance to go to school. When Malala was 10 years old, the Taliban arrived at Swat Valley. The group's leader, Fazlullah, started an illegal radio channel so that he could speak directly to the community. His broadcasts were nicknamed Radio Mullah. The earthquakes that had recently shaken the valley were a punishment from God, he said, and if people didn't stop listening to music and dancing and watching movies, more terrible things would happen. Malala's father told her that Fazlullah was wrong. He's just fooling people, he said. Still, a lot of people believed him, and soon DVDs and CDs were being burned in huge piles on the street. Malala's family had their TV in a closet and watched it with volume low. But more and more people were listening to Radio Mullah, and every day new proclamations were made. Men must not shave, beauty parlors must close, women should not go to the bazaar to shop. Radio Mullah also began speaking against education for women. The school was threatened, and there were no more trips for Malala and her classmates. Girls were not supposed to be seen outside. Even board games were banned. One day, Malala went to class and found her teacher in tears. The woman's husband, a police officer, had been killed. The Taliban was taking over the police stations. Finally, the Taliban moved to Pakistan's capital city of Islamabad. The violence escalated and the Pakistani army sent troops to the Swat Valley to confront them. Fighting broke out in the hills outside Malala's town. Schools were closed and Malala stayed home, listening to the gunfire. Eventually, the Taliban were outnumbered and the Fazlullah retreated to the mountains, but the Taliban had not been driven away, and Fazlullah still broadcast on the radio. Malala dreamed of becoming an inventor and making an anti-Taliban machine that would sniff out the men hiding in the hills and destroy their guns. Nearly every day, the valley was rocked by bomb blasts. Despite the turbulence around her, Malala earned the highest marks in her class. She liked performing. She even wrote a funny little skit about government corruption and played a lead character. With all the bad stuff going on these days, she wrote later, we needed small, small reasons to laugh. Malala's father joined a group of elders to work for peace. He became the group's spokesman and gave interviews on the radio. He organized a peace march and encouraged his students to speak out against what was happening. Malala began giving interviews, too, talking about the importance of education for girls. But by the end of 2008, the Taliban had destroyed around 400 schools, and then came an announcement from Fazlullah. As of January 15, 2009, all girls must stop going to school. Malala refused to believe it, but the date was fast approaching. One day, she overheard her father talking to a friend who worked for BBC Radio. The friend was looking for a schoolgirl who would be willing to write about life under the Taliban. Malala volunteered. Her words were published online every week. It was too dangerous to use her real name, so she wrote under the name Gul Maki. A lot of people read Malala's words. Then the New York Times made a documentary called Class Dismissed in Swat Valley. The filmmakers interviewed Malala on her last day of classes. They cannot stop me, she said defiantly, but when she got home from school, she cried and cried. The fighting between the Taliban and Pakistani army continued. When Malala was 12, she and her family, along with almost 2 million people, were forced to flee the Swat Valley. Many had to go to refugee camps, but Malala's family went to her mother's village where they stayed with Malala's uncle. 3 months later, the Prime Minister announced that the Taliban had been driven out of the valley and Malala and her family returned home. Her father's school reopened and Malala was happy to see her friends. Best of all, after years of no school trips, she and her classmates were invited to spend a few days in Islamabad, attending workshops to help them recover from the trauma of her life under the Taliban. The capital city was very different from the Swat Valley. There, the girls saw that the women could be doctors, lawyers, and activists. Around Malala's 13th birthday, terrible flooding struck the country. When the water finally receded, her school was filled with foul-smelling mud. Thousands of people died and millions more were affected. There was no clean water or electricity. As the country struggled to recover, it became clear that the Taliban had never really left. More schools were blown up and more people were killed. Malala was scared, but she was also determined. She vowed to become a politician and continue to speak out publicly about education. At age 14, she was awarded Pakistan's first National Peace Prize for her activism. Malala was becoming well known. Her voice was being heard by millions, and the Taliban didn't like what she was saying. Wanting to silence her, they made death threats. Her father suggested that she go away to boarding school, but Malala did not want to leave. Still, she checked all the doors and windows every night, and she began taking a bus to and from school instead of walking. One day, when 15-year-old Malala was riding the bus home with her best friend Muniba, the Taliban found her and shot her. Amazingly, Malala survived the attack. She was rushed to the hospital where emergency surgery saved her life. The hospital was guarded by soldiers with snipers keeping watch from the roofs. Everyone feared another attack on Malala and her family, so Malala was flown to England where she could get the best care to help her recover from her devastating injuries. When she regained consciousness a week later, she was in a hospital in Birmingham. Malala's recovery was long and difficult, but millions of people worldwide were cheering her on. After she left the hospital, she and her family stayed in England. With her father, she started the Malala Fund, a charity dedicated to helping all girls receive an education. On her 16th birthday, she went to New York City and to speak with the United Nations, calling on world leaders to give free education to every child. She received a standing ovation, and at age 17 she became the youngest person to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Malala Yousafzai continues to be a courageous and passionate activist for the right to education for girls. She travels to many countries to meet girls who are fighting to go to school under challenging circumstances, facing war and poverty, as well as gender based discrimination. And she makes sure that people around the world hear their stories too. And I think that's where we are going to end our stories. I thank you for listening, and we will be back next time with some more. Thanks. Bye.